Welcome to OCD Whisperer Podcast. Today I have a very special guest with me, Kelley Franke, and Kelley is a licensed therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety. She received her degree in Pepperdine University, and she uses CBT, mindfulness-based CBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, all in her work with her clients with OCD at the OCD Center of LA. But she's also a co-author of the BFRB's subscription series called Reflections on Skin Picking and Hair Pulling. And she's a co-host of Purely OCD podcast on all things OCD. Welcome to the show, Kelley.
Thank you so much, Christina, for having me.
Thank you. I am super excited that I get to have you today and that we're going to be talking a little bit about a couple of things that have come up quite a bit for listeners, and especially as we're in this holiday season and kind of wrapping up 2021 and heading into 2022, and what another year.
I know.
Yeah.
Hopefully this one will be better.
We're crossing fingers. Everybody's crossing fingers. So a couple of kind of bigger questions that I've received, I wanted to address today with you. One of the questions that comes up quite often is people ask, how do OCD symptoms return? And this is a question I think that's, for folks who've either had treatment like ERP, or maybe they did some self kind of guided course, or maybe they haven't even fully quite done it yet, but they feel like things keep coming back. So I think this is a question that comes up a lot, like why and how does the symptoms return? If you can talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I think that it's kind of a tricky question because I don't know for me personally if OCD has ever gone entirely. So I assume the question is more geared towards when there's a new flare up, right? Or is that what?
That's what I would think. I think, I think in general, there's two things. I think some folks feel like, if I get treatment, then somehow like it will kind of stop. And sometimes people do experience everything subsides and it's kind of quiet and people feel kind of excited, like, okay, like I'm back to my old self. Like everything's good. I got my life back. And then suddenly, bam, right? There's a trigger or there's a flare up or an old theme or a new theme. And so I think there's going to be frustration in that process. And this is kind of a question that keeps coming up of like, oh my God, like why does it keep coming back? Or why does it, why do these symptoms return?
Right. So the way I would address it is OCD is a lifelong disorder, which I know people don't like to hear, but it isn't a death wish. It isn't this chronic. There can be remission, of course. And oftentimes if there is treatment, there will be. Right? Like people respond to ERP very well. And, there's so many reasons why OCD could come back. I often see it when there's a huge life transition or trigger like that, like moving, getting married, having children, all the major ones, right? Going to college. Ultimately, we don't really have control over when OCD wants to come back though, right? It's going to happen. It's going to happen. But we can use the tools that we've been taught and what we use hopefully ongoing, which has kept us in remission, to mitigate that next flare up. But that doesn't mean it will ever even come, right? We have no certainty in that either. So that's my experience of it.
Yeah. And I wonder too, if, as you were talking, I was just thinking about, even if, let's say somebody has done ERP, and let's say that things are kind of more quiet and maybe they don't feel like they kind of need to do much planned exposure work or anything, and they're just kind of going about their life. And then, I think one of the things that I definitely have seen sometimes, and I myself have certainly been guilty of doing is, when sometimes you kind of,
I'm sure,
right? Like you're not paying attention a little bit and then, you kind of like little compulsions creep in.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why I always tell people there's no such thing as a small compulsion, because once you do a little bit of something, and then if you're not paying attention and you're absent-minded, before you know it, suddenly you're starting to feel more anxious, more restless, more uncomfortable. Things seem to be escalating a little bit more and a little bit more. And then you're like, oh, wait a minute, whoops. And you might have not even realized that you just started to compulse.
Yeah, just compounds. Yeah, so staying vigilant, but I also think it's tricky. I don't want to tell people you have to do exposure work all the time and be just on guard, because that's also not helpful either, right? So my goal is to help my clients anyways, just that's how they live now, right? Integrate into, I'm going to live a more mindful way, and I'm going to be more present, and that it's okay that every once in a while I do slip and I do take, OCD or anxiety takes control of the wheel,
Mhm.
but to come back faster and faster each time.
Yeah.
But for sure, if we're going to get complacent with it entirely and be like, oh, it's fine, the permission giving statements, right? Like one compulsion won't matter. We'll see how that goes if we keep doing it, right? It's going to
Yeah.
compound. It's going to make it harder, even harder than it would have been right before that if you had not done a bunch of compulsions. So the next time it comes around, it's going to be 10 times harder to resist it. So yes, being definitely cognizant of the fact that it is a lifelong disorder, and knowing that, you're somebody who has OCD and that your brain tends to do this, and no different than somebody who has, some type of health issue. Is like, okay, I have a health issue. My heart's bad. Okay. So sometimes when I do X, Y, and Z, these things happen, and this is how I handle it.
Yeah, and I think part of what I'm also hearing you say, really, it's that accountability piece with
Yeah.
yourself, really, right? Just holding yourself responsible for, yeah, if you're justifying or giving yourself a lot of permission for things, and then recognizing, that's a really slippery slope. And I love that
Yeah.
analogy. It's like, yeah, if you're living with, some sort of a medical condition, you'll have to do things just a little differently sometimes, or really also kind of be in a preventative state.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like this. It's like, hey, why let things fall apart again and having to feel like it just start completely over, when you can actually be in maintenance mode, or you can be in that preventative mode. And like if a brain is a muscle,
Yeah.
like everything else, like it'll atrophy if you don't use it. So like, let's use it.
People with OCD use it too much.
Sometimes for sure, but also in ways where it's compulsory versus
Really,
like,
totally. I was
yeah.
just thinking, and it's just a bad joke. But yeah, stop being in our head so much, please. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that, well, so that's actually a great segue to my next question, which is, and this may be really commonly asked, but I do want to hear your take on it. People ask the question of, why do I have OCD? So, or why does someone have OCD, from just what we currently know in terms of research and understanding how OCD works? What would you say?
Well, there's this saying in the psychology world of nurture versus nature, which I know, Christina, you're aware of. But for those of you listening, it's this idea of like, where does a mental disorder come from? Is it from somebody? Is it biological, right? Is it nature? Or is it nurture in like the environment you've grown in? And I think the argument overwhelmingly is it's probably both, right? Biologically, we know it can be um, passed on in generations, right? Like your chances are higher if your mom has OCD, or your father has OCD, but that
Mhm,
doesn't mean it's like gonna happen. It's not definitive, right?
mhm,
So then there's also the nurture aspect, is like, if genetically you are prone and you're already front loaded with that, and then you're living in an environment where you're always anxious and you're always on guard, well, it's going to be a really beautiful explosion of OCD. Maybe not though, too, right? It's like, these are all theories and there's evidence that supports the biological piece, but it makes sense that biologically, if we are prone to it, that living in an anxiety provoking state all the time in an environment that's constantly stressed, the likelihood of developing OCD is going to be higher.
Yeah,
What are your
that's actually
thoughts?
such a beautiful like summary, I think. One of the best ones I've heard in a while.
Okay, good.
Yeah, because I think sometimes, we get away, or we start to kind of go into so many different territories, and people start to go deep into, well, is it a neurotransmitter? Is it a trauma? Is it and I think the
Right.
reality is like, it really is just like you said, right? All of those things, yes, they all matter, but it's really, I love that, like if you're already born with that predisposition, and if you're also having an environmental component that's constantly in that state of stress and distress, it definitely, your chances are higher that, it can trigger
Yeah.
your
It
OCD.
only makes sense, right?
Yeah,
Makes sense.
exactly. Exactly. And I'm thinking about so many different situations, whether it's, like, trauma on all levels, sexual, financial, verbal, physical.
Right.
We're talking about, if you're, in a really bad relationship, or if you're dealing with some intense personality
Yeah.
issues, chronic nonstop, and you can't quite get out of things. I mean, all of those kind of situations that we can all think of, are highly, highly stressful. And
Yeah.
yeah. And I actually do have a follow-up with this, which is, what's your take on, how does stress impact OCD?
Not good. But yeah, a few things. How does it impact it? Well, when my clients or myself, when I'm having like a good streak, let's say, and I feel like, okay, I'm having intrusive thoughts every once in a while, but they don't bother me as much. But then I'm really stressed, right? Like I've got, a child and maybe she's out sick, but I still have clients and work I have to do. And, maybe I have a bunch of bills that I have to pay, and all these things are stacked against me. I'm not sleeping well. So that means I'm not really eating well. So I'm not exercising because I don't have time to get out of the house and go for a jog. That's not a good setup for anybody. Your stress level, now you've reduced your ability to fight a compulsion effectively, right? Like the chances are I am going to compulse are much higher at that point because I'm just reduced entirely. But yeah, I mean, intrusive thoughts can become more frequent. Sometimes they actually can go away. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. It's like when we're in total fight or flight response, meaning like we have to move and like everything's on the line and your brain gets so consumed with like the problem in front of you, the real life problem solving, that the intrusive thoughts kind of turn down a little. It's like, oh, well, of course, because you didn't have time in your brain to sit there and think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even as you just said that, I mean, in my personal example, I've been kind of open about it, but, around my birthday, mid-April, found out my mom definitely, has cancer, and it's, like stage 3 and advanced and aggressive and like all this stuff. Right. So like, that was one of those where suddenly it's like, that first phase of like shock and just kind of like, "Bleh," right. Taking it in. Thank you.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Talk about stress. So here's a great example, everybody.
Right, exactly. Right. So here's one where like, honestly, like I don't remember most of May. I was kind of hazy, but then
out.
Yeah, kind of like just doing whatever day to day. Right. But and by June, I do recall like that initial, just because you're so in it, like what you just described, and that thing that's just right in front of you, that there were not only were there no compulsions, really, it was just getting through the day.
Yeah.
But by June, when it's like, okay, we're now the next step. Then when we, started the first phase of treatment, that's when I noticed, those like, and I have never really had any major like health anxiety OCD. And then suddenly here I am and I'm fine. I didn't even realize it until I caught myself going, oh my God, I feel this urge. Like I have to go to the gym and I have to go run, and then I have to lift these weights. Okay. And then I have to eat clean. And then I'm like, wait a minute. And then,
this
like I
sounds familiar.
Right? Yeah. So I did it for like a good week or so, or a little less, but about a week, honestly, before I finally stopped and went, wait a minute, what's going on here? And then I noticed, like, if I didn't go, then I would feel horrible. Like, I'm like, I feel like I have to go. And I was like, okay, wait a minute. This is that same damn process. I know this. Hold on.
I know you. You just changed hats.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, you know what? Nope, we're gonna have that M&M right now, and we're actually not gonna go jogging today.
Damn straight you are.
Nope, we're not doing it.
But that makes perfect sense, right?
Right.
It's like mom sick, now you're in fight, you're just in total survival mode, shock, and then now you're getting things of the dust has settled a bit, and your brain's like, oh, have you ever thought about maybe if you would die?
Exactly. So it's stuff like that, right? And that's one of those where already having that predisposition, knowing, like I have a relationship OCD, that's my big one, and perfectionism. But here it is, it's suddenly morphed into this health anxiety
Right.
piece. And it's still, here and there, like lingers and pops up a little. So I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, that's cool. I see it. Right. But that's an example of that nature nurture, right? That biology and environment. And then here it is together. And then in that moment, you're not thinking about it, but then later suddenly, because that's what OCD does. It'll suddenly get sticky and stuck on something.
Yeah.
And because right now it's so important for me in my life, it's like my
Yep.
brain is latching onto it.
Yeah, it's like that's exactly it. And going back to the very first question, which is why would OCD come back? What are the reasons? Well, it's just we haven't accepted uncertainty in that content area, right? Is like you have in the relationship stuff, but have you with health? No, not until about a week in you did.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation and just
Yeah.
being real and open. I mean, I think that's the value, and that's at least what I always try to do on my podcast and on the show is really really just have real talk, because this is the kind of stuff everybody with OCD deals with, and
Mhm.
those kind of recurrent questions that we all get. And even if you've had treatment, um, you can still come right back to a place of doubting again and complete uncertainty. And sometimes it can feel frustrating and annoying, and you can be even really pissed off about, oh,
Oh, I know the resentment, the
right, like,
anger.
man, oh, right. But then I think, like I always say to folks, don't live there for too long, right? Visit it, feel it, let it pass, and then let's come back.
That's such a good point, right? Notice it's there, but don't let it interfere with you getting better now.
Exactly. Yeah. So with that, what are maybe any word of hope or inspiration you'd like to leave us with today?
Oh, that is a good one. You're not alone. I think living with OCD, it's a lonely disorder, as I experienced it anyways, and I think a lot of other people experience it, especially when sometimes sharing the content can be reassurance seeking, and so it's hard to process out loud with people. Uh, but I think there's a sense of community either online or in podcasts, right? Like here, people listening here, maybe they feel a little bit less alone. So you're not alone. These thoughts can be very taboo as well. So the chances are they're not going to share it. But if you hear other people who have similar intrusive thoughts, you're like, hey, wait a minute. I am not the only one.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
you're not alone.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And if people would like to find you, how can they find you?
So I work at OCD LA, and if you wanted to contact me through that, you can email me at Kelley at OCDLA.com, and it's spelled Kelley. And my Instagram page at obsessive-compulsive treatment. And you can also find me at purelyocd.com, which is the podcast I co-host with Lauren Rosen. And we would love to have you on as well, Christina. We had already talked about it. So we'll have to brainstorm something good to pick your brain about.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, that'll
Thank
be really fun.
you. Yeah, it
Yeah.
will be fun. It will be fun. And thank
Awesome.
you for having me on.
Oh my God. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.